argue that, oh, we're good?
We're good.
Okay, good. So structuralists argue that by studying the underlying structure of a story, one can draw meaning from that story. Beyond the field of literary studies, structuralists believe that structures dictate every aspect of human life. An example of the structure that affects human life could be an economic structure. A structuralist would look at the way that the economy shapes society in different ways depending on your class position, and would see an individual as a product of their structure or the position that they live within. They therefore study structures of social organization rather than a person's experience of social structures. In post-structuralism, as I mentioned before, post-structuralism is a critique of the ideas. So where structuralism focuses on structures of social organizations and patterns of human behavior, in post-structuralism, the individual is the point of interest rather than the structures which might dictate their life. So to go back to the literature example of West Side Story, Romeo and Juliet, post-structuralism looks to the reader rather than the structure of story to draw meaning about that text. This is because each new reader comes to each new text with their own knowledge and own biases, and therefore draws meaning from that text that is relevant to their own personal experience. Post-structuralism also asserts the meaning the author intended to communicate through a text is secondary to the meaning the reader draws from a text. Post-structuralism also rejects the structural idea that a text has a single meaning that is drawn from its underlying structure. Post-structuralism allows us to realize how the meanings of a text can change depending on where, how, and when it's read, and by who. This is because the meaning of a text shifts in relation to variables usually involving the identity of a reader. So beyond literary theory, this position is generalizable to any situation in which a person observes a symbol or a signifier of a structure. So what would that look like? Something that's important to point out at this point in our discussion is that structuralist theory, as I previously mentioned, emerged during the 19th century. And as you all probably know, the 1800s were a period characterized by colonial entanglements of the British Empire in Africa, India, South America, Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as Canada and the United States. Subsequently, the empire's colonial entanglements across the globe come to bear on the changing organization of the European economy, society, and culture. As I mentioned when I gave the example of the Romeo and Juliet West Side Story, structuralist literary analysis structures often rely upon binaries to create opposition, difference, and conflict in a story, as in that example. The use of binary reasoning extends far beyond literature and was essential during the colonial moment of the 19th century. As the European Empire enforced itself onto other countries all around the globe, they had, as I like to say, a crisis of identity. So as European people were met with a veracity of sophisticated economies, religions, languages, and cultures different from their own, their assumed supremacy as the most developed race of peoples was undermined. Instead of pausing and embracing this difference, Europe continued its quest to dominate every corner of the globe, extracting people to work as slaves and the natural resources of these lands to strengthen the economy and power of Britain. These are obviously very large sweeping statements, so I want to discuss the example of one woman who was coerced by British colonists to work in Britain as an entertainer. Her story in many ways examples the different methods European colonizers undertook to reinforce their self-image as the world's dominant race. Sergeant Hartman, pictured here, was born in 1789 in the Gamtoos Valley of South Africa. When she was barely in her 20s, she was sold to a Scottish doctor named Alexander Dunlop, accompanied by a showman named Hendrik Cesar. She spent 4 years in Britain being exhibited at freak shows and in the private homes of the wealthy for her large buttocks, a result of the condition of pseudopecia. Her treatment caught the attention of British slave abolitionists who tried to rescue her on the grounds that they felt her performance was indecent and that she was being forced to perform against her will. However, ultimately, the court ruled in favor of Cesar, her captor, after a contract between Bartman and Dunlop was produced, which allegedly bore Sarchi's signature in agreement to be taken overseas. Historians, however, disagree as to the nature and authenticity of the contract itself, as Sarchi was believed to be illiterate at the time that she came to England in the English language. In 1814, after Dunlop's death, she traveled to Paris and continued to entertain the public. While in Paris, she was subjected to examination by Georges Cuvier, a professor of comparative anatomy at the Museum of Natural History. Comparative anatomy is the study of similarities and differences in the anatomy of different species. It is closely related to evolutionary biology and phylogeny, which is the study of evolution of species. It also depends upon structuralist logics as well as binary thinking. Comparative anatomy has long served as evidence for evolution. It indicates that various organisms share a common ancestor. Also, it assists scientists in classifying organisms based on similar characteristics of their anatomical structures. Comparative anatomy supports Darwin's theory of descent with modification, also known as evolution. Whare was interested in studying Sarchi because during this period, there was a widely held belief in the scientific community that African people represented a de-evolved class of human beings. Comparative anatomists like Georges Cuvier studied the anatomies of Black slaves brought to the empires to try and prove that they represented the missing link between humans and primates. So remember that this explicitly racist research is taking place at the height of colonial enterprise in Africa. Additionally, at this time, slavery is largely still the norm in England, though slave trade itself had been abolished in 1807. In order for Europeans to confirm to themselves their position as the world's most developed race, it was essential that they construct themselves along a binary with other ethnicities in which they came in contact with. Upon death, Bartman's body was sent to Georges Cuvier's laboratory at the Museum of Natural History for examination. Cuvier wanted to examine her body to test his theory that the more primitive the mammal, the more pronounced would be the sexual organs and sexual drive of that person. Bartman refused to be an experiment while she was alive. But just Cuvier and many others would compare the theoretically heightened sex drive of Black women with the dormant sexuality of European women who were thought to be essentially without sexuality. In the drawings, Bartman's each this social construct of visual imagery amplified and reinforced racist perspectives on Black female sexuality, as well as furthering the oppression of European female sexuality. With permission from police, Cuvier, who had amassed the world's largest collection of human and animal specimens, conducted an autopsy on Bartman's dead body. First, he made a cast of her body, then he preserved her brains and genitals. Cuvier concluded that the Hottentots, or the Khoikhoi women, from which Sarchi descended, were closer to great apes than humans, thus assigning them non-human status and reinforcing the genetic dominance of European peoples. The importance of such research was not only to confirm the superiority of European people, but also to justify slavery. By likening African people to animals, their enslavement was not an affront to human rights, but rather the domestication of an otherwise uncivilized species. This process has been called a process of othering. This concept was first introduced by philosopher Friedrich Hegel in the late 18th century. Hegel suggested that the individual constructs their identity by defining themselves against what they are not to learn what they are. To put this very simply, this would be like a process of recognizing an apple and saying, okay, if that's an apple, I'm not an apple because I'm not spherical red and filled with juice. Of course, when European colonizers applied this process of recognition to other people, they not only differentiated themselves on a basis of physical difference, but applied negative attributes to the physical differences of the other. So during the establishment of the European empires, namely England, as we have already touched on, but also Spain, Portugal, and France, maintaining unequal imperial relations required subordination of the other. And the other here was namely the native peoples of the land that was being colonized in order to facilitate the exploitation of their labor, of their lands, and of their natural resources. This meant that they were not only denied legal status and access to human rights, but they were also systematically degraded in the minds of European people so that their enslavement would seem justifiable. To realize those ends, the process of othering culturally justifies the domination and subordination of a people by placing them as the other, as different, and as less than. This process of othering was systematic and thorough, so much in fact that it unfortunately has prevalence today in contemporary race relations. Even the legacy of Sarchi Bartman has been revived in very insensitive ways. One of the humiliations Sarchi was subjected to was having objects balanced on her buttocks. In the 1970s, the prominent photographer Jean-Paul Goude photographed then-girlfriend Grace Jones on the left, pictured on the left, with a photoshopped image of a champagne glass balanced on her back. Jean-Paul revived the image in 2014, this time with popular TV reality person Kim Kardashian as a subject, but with the same photoshopped effects. Both of these photos were met with mixed criticism. Jean-Paul's initial photograph of Grace Jones appeared in a collection of photos entitled Jungle Fever. If you've never heard that term before, it refers to the racial fetishization of women of color by white men. According to a People magazine article written about the couple in 1979, quote, Jean-Paul has been fascinated with women like Grace since his youth. The son of a French engineer and an American-born dancer, he grew up in a Paris suburb. From the moment he saw West Side Story and the Alvin Ali dance troupe, he found himself captivated by, quote, ethnic minorities, Black girls, Puerto Ricans. I had jungle fever. Here you can see the permutations of the visual and racialized construction of Black women's bodies and the way that these depictions have come to bear on the contemporary representation of Black women. It also illustrates the way that structuralist thinking and the imposition of binary thinking is still prevalent throughout our culture. Fortunately, post-structuralist theorists like Michael Foucault, Edward Said, and Judith Butler, among others, have published canonical works that deconstruct binary logic. So to close on a positive note so that we can get into some good discussion, I just wanted to share with you an Edward Said quote because he's one of my favorite writers, and if you haven't read Orientalism, which is his most famous text, you absolutely should. And in this text, Edward Said says, "All knowledge that is about human society and not about the natural world is historical knowledge, and therefore rests upon judgment and interpretation. This is not to say that facts and data are non-existent, but that facts get their importance from what is made of them in interpretation, for interpretations depend very much on who the interpreter is, who she or he is addressing, what his or her purpose is, and what historical moment the interpretation takes place. My argument is that history is made by men and women, just as it can also be unmade and rewritten." Thank you. So, Vaughn, did you have the questions? I can pull them up on my email out.
Yes. Lucy, thank you very much for your presentation. I know I asked she's transcript, so she sent me a draft of the transcript of the presentation. I've asked her if we could have a copy of that. So she is going to send us a copy of the presentation if we ever wanted to reference today's session. So thank you very much for that. Emma, thank you very much for making us look a little bit inadequate as some of us lecturers that up to speed with Prezi, and just the amount of effort you've put into your presentation to share with us is really humbling, so thank you very much. Emma and I sort of discussed maybe some questions that we could start having a dialogue around to help us make sense of these ideas. And for our year ones in particular who have been introduced to some of these theories and concepts already this year, and our year twos that have to think real hard in terms of what they were introduced to last year. But there were 6 questions, so they're up on the whiteboard. I'm just perhaps wondering if, to start with, I might ask you, Emma, sort of in your own words, how you might define structuralism and binary opposition, and what the sort of key ideas are for you in terms of your understanding.
Yeah, so I think with my understanding, structuralism, it's not that it's necessarily entirely bad. There are definitely ways that when you study a structure, especially when you're looking at literary theory, that it can be really helpful for deriving meaning from a story. It's just the danger of structuralism is that it relies so heavily on the creation of a binary, so there being A and then B, and defining A against B. And then that relationship ends up, if you're applying that binary logic when you're talking about 2 different cultures, 2 different ethnicities, 2 different countries, when you posit one as B and you posit one as A, what ends up happening is that A becomes the referent and everything is based off of that referent. And that was very largely the process that colonizers used as they were going through the world and saying, well, they're not like us, therefore they are less than. And that's incredibly problematic. And so that's where post-structuralism comes in to say, well, that's actually very much based in your own prejudices and biases, and is not in fact just a truth and an unpolitical knowledge. It's a claim, and it is subjected to your positionality, where you're speaking from, and what you're trying to evoke by what you're saying. So it unsettles that kind of the imperialization, along with the domination of lands, also the imperialization of European knowledge and the way that European people tried to configure the world in their self-image. So I guess those are probably my 2 big takeaways.
Thanks again for describing that probably better than I ever have. Are there any questions just in terms of that first question that we've asked? from any of our students or our lecturers, Gary in Auckland. Sorry, Emma, just to give you some context, there's us in the Bay of Plenty, sunny Bay of Plenty, centre of the universe. And then we have our other family, our other students are in Auckland, which is our metropolis, our largest city. So I'm just wondering if Gary, you have any questions or?
No. First, I'd just like to endorse the welcome that was given to you, Emma, when we first opened the session, and say no mahai haramai also on behalf of the Auckland cohort. And I like the way you positioned yourself first at the introduction to your short narrative, and was intrigued about the story about the African woman who unfortunately suffered at the hands of colonialists and was oppressed throughout her life. My interest in this, and I guess it's a question that I'd like to see, is like, at what stage in your academic career did you think that you started to look at your own position and relate it to the position of the Indigenous people that were there in Canada? Was there a moment of awakening for you, or a time that you thought that maybe I need to start looking at this, and how did that happen for you?
That's a really great question. Thank you. I think that growing up on the island, there is a very strong Indigenous community there. It was always something that I was aware of, but I didn't become critical of my own complicity in the current moment of colonization until moment. But I do remember there was one class that I took about 3 years ago, which was on Whare literature that has been written in Canada. And in that class, my professor was very, very, he introduced poststructuralism essentially, and it was a very large concept for me. So I think probably the first few times that I had somebody explain it to me, it really didn't settle. But the more that I've looked into this, the more that I realize how much it is, like, it has informed in my previous conceptions of myself and my privilege, and the way that like post-structuralism has allowed me to be like very, very critical of that, and has been very humbling. I don't know if there's one moment, but it's definitely something that it's so important to the kind of work that I'm doing now, especially because I'm going in to do my MA next year. So it's going to be really central to that. But I think that it was kind of just like, there was a moment where in that class where I was kind of like, okay, like this is this whole thing that I haven't been thinking about, and I need to do the work to think about it, because if I don't do that work to challenge my privilege and to challenge white settler culture here, then I'm leaving that work up entirely to the Indigenous people here, and that's not fair.
Sure. Wow. Challenge my privilege.
Thank you, Emma.
Can I just ask one other thing, Vaughan, if it's okay? You probably know, Emma, that there's different understandings or different types of intensities of this notion of privilege, and I'm just curious as to know your view of privilege. And I hope I'm not being too personal here, but there's a type of privilege that I think that it's all-consuming, and it isolates the person from the whole picture, and it can isolate a community. I'm just curious about your definition of privilege.
Yeah, I think that your example is very true in a lot of circumstances, especially in my experience going through the education system. It's a completely different experience to go through school knowing that people who look like me are going to be with them in every level of my government. So I don't even question those things because they're so naturalized to me. And it wasn't until I came to university that I started to think this is actually really problematic and is not representative of the kind of communities that are gathered here in Canada. I think that, yeah, thinking about privilege is something that I try to do all of the time, because I don't think that the work, like, I will never be able to undo my own privilege until all of the systems of oppression are also undone, because it's those systems of oppression that put me in a place of privilege. And I do think that my privilege does, as I gave in the example of like going through that education system, it does make you blind to the different kinds of experiences that people are having next door to you. So at the same time, though, I'm also, subject to the oppression of being a woman and living in a society that is very patriarchal, especially in a university setting too, where it's very male dominated. So it is that kind of balancing that line between, what do I need to be accountable for? How much do I need to deconstruct my own actions? And then how much do I need to go beyond deconstruction to actually do activism? Yeah. Big question.
Thank you, Emma, for sharing that.
Thanks, Greg, for some questions. I'm just wondering from our students, does anyone have something else?
Okay.
Emma, I was just fascinated in your introduction when you're acknowledging the Indigenous people in Canada, and you used that word, I think you said stolen territories. Is that the word you used?
Yes, it is.
I was fascinated because that's a word we'd never use here in New Zealand to describe the Indigenous relationship between Māori and non-Māori here. And it suggests to me, I guess my question one is that a common term that the Canadian people refer to the Indigenous people in the lands that they come from?
It's not a common term within mainstream culture and mainstream knowledge in Canada. It is a very common term within people who are doing activist work, and it's a term that we borrow and echo from Indigenous activist work here, who see their land as unlawfully taken and as stolen territory, because they don't honor the treaties that were made with the government as well. It's not even the process of like seeing it as legal or not legal. It's seeing it as that the creation and parsing up of this territory into different plots that are controlled differently, but are all controlled under the federal government, are not Indigenous, or do not accord with Indigenous ways of understanding land, territory, and the communities that they had that interacted with each other in very different ways. So it's to acknowledge that the way that the government talks about land as territory and as property is a neoliberal invention and is a colonial invention, and they do not adhere, like they don't co-sign it.
Right. And just one more question quickly. You just had a new Prime Minister sworn in, eh? Yeah,
Pardon?
You just had a new Prime Minister sworn in.
Yes.
Now, I watched him on TV. First thing that struck me was his age. He only looks like he's about 20 to start off with. But listening to his rhetoric or his talk was very much about acknowledging those wrongs that were done in the past in a very strong, powerful way. He was talking very emotively. So I think, when I hear a Prime Minister of a country talking like that, that shows that there's a great well of change to acknowledge some of the things that perhaps have happened in the past. And the other thing I'd just like to share with you, I met a guy here last year who was living in New Zealand. He was a Canadian Indian, I can't remember his tribe. And he spoke to me about how for him growing up, he went to university and he was almost like blacklisted from his own people for going into that university system. It shows me that challenge of, we talk about structuralism, so structuralism switched around from the other way. So for him having to get into education, he had to turn his back on the people. That was how he was seen as. So I just wanted to bring those points up. One, to acknowledge the Prime Minister seems he's got a real swell of goodwill, if you like, towards some of the things that have happened in the past, but also on the other side, from an Indigenous perspective, the young warrior that was with me last year shared how tough it still is in that space with him.
Yeah, to answer the first part, Justin Trudeau, I think that there's a lot of support for him in Canada right now because our previous government, we had a conservative government for 8 years, and that conservative government was voted in without popular support because of the electoral system that we have in Canada, which Justin Trudeau is actually trying to change into a first past the post system so that the candidate with the most popular support is able to be in office. I think that people have a lot of hope for him, and especially in the areas that I work in, there's a lot of hope for him fixing what the previous government had kind of degraded in the relationship between the federal government and the different Indigenous communities in Canada. That being said, in Canada right now, there is a unprecedented amount of Indigenous suicides in rural communities. The government has yet to address this issue. It's in the Ottawa-Piscat Nation in Ontario. So he's very new in the presidency, and I think we're kind of all waiting with bated breath to see how he's going to handle these things. But there's definitely, he will do a better job than the previous government. And it's just, will it be enough? And is there any way that a federal government, which is a colonial creation, can ever be in a positive relationship with Indigenous people here? And depending on who you talk to through those Indigenous communities, the answer is different. In regards to the second point about the student that you met who felt partially alienated from their community, I have spoken to other Indigenous students at UBC who have experienced the exact same issue, because there is a rightful mistrust in some Indigenous communities of the university, especially when it's a university like UBC that is built on stolen, ancestral, unceded Musqueam territory. And I mean, the university itself, it does not acknowledge that history. I mean, like, there's a rose garden on our campus that is this beautiful lookout point, and that was a very important spiritual ground for the people, like for the Musqueam people. Nobody talks about that. That's not acknowledged in the structure of the university or by the body of the university. So I understand that mistrust, but then you speak to these Indigenous youth who are coming into the university, and they're a lot of the time taking Indigenous courses, and they're trying to bring this knowledge back into their communities and trying to find a solution. So it's just, I think it is a little generational. I think it's that there's this kind of hope with the younger generation that there can be a bridge built, and then the older generation who have also gone through the residential school system here, like, that's still very much that's a huge trauma wound in those communities that it's still being dealt with. So you can understand why that mistrust would be there for them.
Thanks, Emma. I've got another question for you.
Kia ora, Emma. My name is Karen. I'm a Year 2 student. I'm keen to ask you your understanding, because I realise it pulls out of the structuralism theory, what your understanding of essentialism is.
Yeah, essentialism. Yeah, so to put it very simply, essentialism is, I always go back to thinking about, to answer that question from my own positionality. Essentialism, when I'm speaking from the position of a woman, is to just see us as we function to be reproductive bodies for men. And it's to not see us as autonomous beings, to not see us as outside of our different layers of oppression. It's just to see us as basically how we've been created by the different systems of oppression that have come to constitute who we are in our culture, and not seeing us as individual people with our individual desires, our individual politics, and all those complicated things that go into being your own person. It's a different conversation when you're talking about the way that Indigenous or African people, as in the example that I talked about, have been systematically degraded. But I think very much, like, just to put it generally across the board, it's when you just kind of, you just don't see somebody as an individual, but you just see them as a product of oppression, I guess. Do you feel like that's in line?
I'd probably take it from probably the flip side of that essence within us could be unique as well, and there could be positive side to that uniqueness of who you are. So, yeah. But kia ora. Anyone else?
Yeah, I do. I have a question. Kia ora, Emma. I'm Wi-Fi. I'm here too as well. Awesome to have you here. I'm just going back to the privilege thing. One of the common themes now that we're hearing here in our country at Aotearoa is that we Māori, the Indigenous, are privileged. Is that something that happens there?
Yes, it's funny you bring that up because so I volunteer in the Downtown East Side in Vancouver, which is one of the poorest districts in Canada. And I volunteer at a women's center, and there is a very large community of Indigenous women who gather there and have community there and do resistance work there. And it's great. There's also white women who are there like me who are working. And I had a conversation with one of the other volunteers at the center who was also a white woman who was of an older generation than I was. And I don't even remember how we got into the conversation. She was just like, oh, you know, Indigenous women have it so easy. They're getting like so much more benefits from the government. They get to go to school for free. Did you know that? And I was like, actually, they don't. Like, that's actually a huge myth. And I can show you a YouTube video that my friend made. like disagrees with that. Like, and I was like, it's really difficult to get money from your band. You have to apply for a scholarship like everybody else does. 17% of Indigenous youth in Canada, like under 20%, receive a little bit of funding from a band scholarship. But most of them are in the exact same position as anybody else. So, and she was just like, oh, wow. Like, I was like, okay. Like,
Thank you.
So yes, there is that prejudice there still. Yeah. But if you're in the kind of community that I'm in, you're like, well, if there is any situation where Indigenous people are getting any kind of like more support than I am from the government, like, of course they should. Like, do you know what the government has subjected them to? Like, that's the least that the government should be doing at this point. So it's, when you talk to somebody who's like in that social justice community, that's not there. But older generations, it's a little more testy.
Yeah, no, I'm like over here, we pay road tax and they take the land from us and then they build the roads, but we still got to pay road tax on our own land in terms of diesel cost and all of that. So it's really quite weird. Our water, we've got a big water situation going where we pay phenomenal amounts for water and then all the other countries are paying way less, you know. So
yeah, that I think that kind of thinking is completely unfounded. So.
Kia ora, Emma, got another question from Sir Kuku Wawatai.
You know, in the world, when there have been issues to do with oppression or disadvantaging people, people go to war. There have been some significant wars over issues. And the matters that we're talking about now have been around for a long time, and people have put up things around resistance theory. I mean, whether we resist. And I think the big question is, what is the best thing we can do which actually can generate the most significant difference to the challenges that we're being subjected to and the things that you've discussed at the moment? So that we're not having this lecture again next year, but we're doing things that actually begins to mitigate all the concerns we have about how structures continue to oppress. And how big does the fight need to be? And do we need to be creating a new global movement? I mean, we have global movements on the economic policies, but there's no global movements. United Nations sort of dabbles, but they don't have the teeth to bite into some of these issues. Mm-hmm. Where do we go to as a result of graduating around the thinking that we're engaging in at the moment, which would make quite a significant difference to the world that we wish to occupy, and to get rid of this notion about it's stolen anymore? We've just got to take it back. And what do we need to do to take it back? What type of new modern battle do we need to get involved with now? I think it's got to be a new type of warfare. I mean, do we sort of release some bugs into the air, or what is it?
Very simple question that you ask. I think that it's probably, it's funny because I had a prof a couple of weeks ago who said that the end of colonialism won't be gentle because the creation of colonialism will be violent. So its deconstruction will also be violent. but what does that look like? And I think that it's really, yeah, I think it's, part of it is definitely doing consciousness raising work, for me to talk to people who are not, you know, lucky as I am to be in a gender, race, sexuality, social justice field and university where I get to access all of this stuff, because these ideas are not part of mainstream knowledge, right? Like, this is not something that's being taught in elementary schools and high schools unless a teacher is kind of taking it upon themselves. However, there are small changes. I know that in our school district in British Columbia next month, the high school teachers are going to workshop about how to teach Indigenous culture in the classroom. So there's small measures being made there. Yeah, if it's a different warfare, would it be like a taking back of the land, and would that be violent? Would that look like wars that have happened in the past, or would that be through, I don't know, like just through raising consciousness and talking and about like getting more people to like come over to that side and like see the issues that are happening and like meet the Indigenous people where they are, instead of asking Indigenous people to do their resistance in a way that makes sense to the colonizer and makes sense to the federal government. So yeah, it's a huge question. I feel like I'm not going to have a really good answer, but yes, definitely something to think about. There was a film that I watched last week. I don't know if you've heard of Elle May Had Tailfeathers. She's an Indigenous filmmaker. She graduated from UBC a few years ago, and she made a film called A Red Girl's Reasoning, which was about the failure of the federal government justice system to represent Indigenous women who have been victims of sexual violence, which is a huge issue in Canada, especially in Vancouver and especially in the Downtown East Side. And basically her film talked about how the government will never help these women because of the way that sexual violence and persecuting sexual violence is so difficult in Canada because of our legislature. And in the film, she basically takes on the role of a vigilante justice and murders white men who have raped Indigenous women. And people watch this film, they're like, this is so violent, it's not the answer. But it's like the reasoning is that it's going to keep happening because the government is not doing anything to protect these women. So she takes it into her own hands, and it's a violent reaction. But, you know, as I said before, perhaps it will necessarily be violent and colonialism. So those are just like two examples of things that I've been thinking about. And I definitely want to keep thinking about that question. It's probably going to be like a long process of thinking about it.
Thanks, Emma. It's really interesting. I've sort of been grappling with that same sort of question, and I gave a presentation at a conference last year, and I used the allegory of the dancing men, but there was a viral sort of Facebook video of a man dancing at a concert on a hill. I'm not in it, but he's all on his own and he's looking quite weird and dancing. And within 5 minutes, he's drawn like 150, 200 people to him, and they're all dancing with him. And it started off as, they call him the lone nut. And so for me, the question that Kuku's asking is what type of war would it be? For me, I think it's a war of the mind. How do we shift our thinking and our attitudes towards certain things? And this program is really important around trying to do that for our own people. And so that's why we introduced them to these, our students to these ideas and concepts. And so allegorically it was about who of us are the lone nuts? Who of us are the ones that are going to stand up and resist, do something different? And then the first followers. Once you get the first followers, then the rest will follow. So it's a really interesting conversation that we're leading into. I'm just sort of aware of time, and we want to get the most out of this little session, so maybe for another 5 or so minutes, if there's any other questions. But what I'd like to pose to you is, one of the things that's quite prevalent at the moment, and obviously around the world, is the GPPA issue. And our business students, I think, have been looking at that. But in one of the questions, distinguished Professor Graham Smith is quoted as saying quite often that colonisation hasn't gone away, it's just in new forms, or different forms. So what we try to encourage our students is that in taking up these ideas, how do we apply them to everyday contexts? So I'm just wondering sort of, with your sort of knowledge and experience that you're learning over the last few years around post-structuralist critique, but if you've had a position in TPPA and the impacts that has sort of from your perspective.
The TPPA? I don't know if I'm familiar with that.
Right, it's a Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Oh, okay, yeah.
TPP.
With fracking on Indigenous communities, right?
Well,
Like oil extraction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a free trade agreement, international free trade agreement between 12 countries. And it's been getting some resistance here because of the impact that it will have on Māori, Indigenous community here, and our treaty between the Crown and ourselves. But, we had a think piece a couple of days ago as the Wānanga. So as our institution, we're trying to find a way to respond to this. And I just saw it as another example of that sort of colonial, imperial sort of approach to sort of, and there's the capitalist element to it as well. There's all these complexities involved around the exploitation of certain groups. So I guess, from a post-structuralist sort of perspective, what might your position be?
Well, I definitely think that it is absolutely an extension of colonialism, and it is the manifestation of colonialism in the current moment, because what we're seeing is, again, the disregard of Indigenous people's right to control their own territory, and the aim of that disregard is to foster wealth of the new empire of the world, or the new world order of the neo-capitalist states. So, yeah, that's a big one. I think, especially in Canada, also with resource extraction, that's a huge issue for Indigenous communities, because the way that they think about land, they don't see themselves as having ownership over it. They see themselves as belonging to the land and being an extension of that, which is the way that their communities are configured, is around that relationship to the earth. So it's once more the federal government not recognizing that relationship and not recognizing that inherent right to organize as they want to organize on their own territory. So, and I think that's also the same thing that's happening in processes of gentrification too, because that is another extension of colonialism, because it's settlers on this territory controlling the way that the land, the way that even the real estate market is being reconfigured. And in that process, it's the poor communities, especially very true in the area that I work in the Downtown East Side, that's becoming a very up and coming neighborhood. It's also the neighborhood where Indigenous people are the most represented in the city. So now these new developments are coming and they're encroaching on this territory. They're upping the price of rent, and it's making it impossible for Indigenous people to live in those areas. So it's, again, the government deciding who gets to live on the land, how do they get to live on the land, and when they're going to do it. And I think it's very similar to the process of resource extraction, and especially in Canada too, with fracking that happens on Indigenous territories that doesn't acknowledge the treaties that are made between the federal government and the nations here, where they're supposed to be the owners of this land.
If I can just comment as well, Vaughan, and acknowledge what's already been said about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and agree with you, Emma, with your comments. But it's also about the Indigenous people understand the situation that they're in at the moment, and and the controversy has been there for many years, and we recognise that as a culture we have been marginalised. With another imposition being put in place, such as the TPP, it's marginalising us even more, and actually putting our place in the community, in the national and the global community, even further back. And at the moment, we have the government who's determining that a partnership with another country is more important than the partnership with the indigenous people, the Māori people. So marginalising is, we're already in the margins. With the TPP coming in, we're going to be placed further back into the margins.
Mm-hmm.
And so we recognise the situation we're in. We're trying to cope with that now, but then there's another pact, another partnership coming in that's going to further marginalise us again. And we have to come up with strategies to deal with that, because it's already been signed. I was part of the process here down in Auckland, standing out there protesting about it, because somehow the government thinks they have the right to determine where our to determine the rights of other people. We're already marginalised. We're just being marginalised more.
Yeah, it's an extension of the oppression that's already happening, and it's the denial of Indigenous ancestral inherent right to govern the lands on which they're living, learning, and growing.
Thank you, Emma. We're probably going to sort of close off shortly. I'll ask Alice to come up and just thank you on behalf of the students. But just personally, I'd just really like to thank you. I've emailed Emma 2 or 3 weeks ago out of the blue and asked her if she would be willing to share with us after discovering her video on YouTube. And she's been in the middle of exams as well, so just heard how fun and to. And so I hope your exams went really well. But we'd like to keep you a part of our whānau, our family, and so we have a Facebook page that I mentioned earlier that we'd like to add you as a friend to, and keep in touch and see how your master's studies are going, and then possibly even next year get you to come in and talk about your studies and what you're doing. One of our members, family members, will be in Vancouver toward the end of the year. Chrissy's going to the University of Northern British Columbia, I think. Is it right? Yeah. And she's really looking forward to that. But we'd like to keep in contact with you. And one way, obviously, is through Facebook. So
yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, great. So I'll just ask Alice to come up.
Kia ora, Emma. Mihi atu ki a koe ki tō mahi tēnei rā tāua. Just on behalf of the group, thank you for taking the time in your busy schedule to talk to us today. There's a couple of things going on. It's very clear when we listen to you talk where you sit as a person, and Kuku raised that concept of what is the new war going to look like, and War and Total put that with the new war is the war of the mind. And I really liked what he said about that analogy of the guy standing up on the hill being the love nut. And well, I certainly know that all of us in this room, and I can see very clearly in yourself, that we're all love nuts. Having said that, yeah, exactly. Having said that, ko te pū o te ngākau me te aroha. So what I mean by that, the essence of the heart is love, and so this war of the mind will be won with love. And so, and actually that lone nuts doesn't sit as well with me as so there's a couple of other things too, like just, I kind of feel like the door has been opened, and I get a strong sense that with Te Awanuiārangi there might be an opportunity somewhere down the line where you'll get to come here and see our land for itself, and we'll expose you to Kuku, and you'll have one day, but
I can't wait.
Yeah, we've got a beautiful country here, and I just wanted to again acknowledge you for your work and what you do. Quite simply, as our tutors keep on telling us, as students, the world needs us, and especially in terms of that bridging that Indigenous way of thinking into the modern world, fighting that modern war of the mind. And I see very, very clearly in you, you're a wahine toa, or a woman warrior in that space. So we thank you again for taking the time to spend with us today, and like we might see you here someday, or conversely, one of us in this room might make it over to see you sometime.
I really hope so. And thank you all so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. Honestly, the pleasure and the privilege is all mine. So thank you very, very much.
What about the faith and Toronto?
I'll just leave you with this last whakatauki that says in Māori, ko wahe oro tonu e te wheke a ka mate koe I te ururo, which basically means don't live your life as the octopus, but die as a shark, which is an analogy for make the most out of life, keep the fight strong, and we wish you the best for your future. Mātua.
Thank you.
That was fast. Okay.
So,
It's still recording.
from that, I gathered that Awanuiārangi sent all us.
When it's here,
No, that's all.
Hello? Somebody's waving out to us.
Can you hear us on the hill?
Yeah.
Because we can't hear you.
No, sorry.
That's all right.
Sorry, Tamaki, what I was just mentioning was that Emma's, most of her kōrero and discussion with us has been recorded, and we'll upload that here for us to have access to it, and that she's going to her transcription of the presentation she did, so that can be referenced for those that want to use it.
Awesome.
The time is
5 o'clock.
if we move to lunch,
Yes.
and back at 12:30. Is that all right, Tamaki?
Right, so.
Yes.
Okay, and we'll go back to the other Zoom, Gary.
Okay then.
Yeah, this one.
Cheers,
No point. No, your ones will be here. Year twos.
Over there.
Yeah, I think it's 10 times. One of those ones will be.
Somewhere over there.
That was this audio. We're going to start fundraising.
Let's go to Canada.
Let's go to Canada.
Oh my God.
I just got new figures. I'm ready.
No, I don't mind.